Hi, in this Spectrum Protect Plus sizing video, we're going to talk about some of the what-if scenarios and how you would alter different values inside of the sizing sheet to customize to meet those scenarios. Let's first look at if your network's not large enough and you need to change the backup replication duration to a longer period of time. Let's take a look at the first example. Here underneath the sizing results, you can see that our peak VSnap front end rate for our 3-year projection is going to be 4 gigabytes per second. Now that is going to be spread across 3 VSnaps, and we would have the peak VSnap front end rate of being 1.3 gigabytes per second for each of those. So if our network cannot handle that, the first thing we can do is look at changing the duration of our backup. So for instance, under our VMware environment, if you went underneath the silver and you went up to the backup duration, it's currently set as 8 hours per day. So we could change that duration, for instance, to 14 hours. And now if we switch back to the sizing results, you'll see that we now require a peak VSnap front end of 2.7 gigabytes per second. And if you scroll down and look at the peak VSnap front end, that's 0.9 gigabytes per second. So that would work on a 1 gigabyte network there. So that's just one example of how you could adjust the backup duration. And of course, you could do that for your applications as well. Now, another thing to look at would be your replication. So if we scroll down and look at the replication copy, we're anticipating 1.3 gigabytes per second being accommodated. And if that doesn't work, we can once again, for instance, go into the VMware and we could scroll down to the daily replication duration hours and change that. So it's currently set to 12. We could change that, for instance, to 18 hours. And then if you were to go back and look at the sizing results, you would see your peak replication rate is now 1 gigabit per second, which would be more likely to work on a 1 gigabit network. Okay, so that's the first example of how you can manipulate the duration of backups and replications to impact the gigabytes per second you're required to have in this environment. Let's look at the second example where we might require more restores or data reuse on a daily basis. So back in the sizing sheet for the primary, if you think you're going to be doing more than an average number of data restores or data reuse on a daily basis, taking this automatic VSnap reserve might not be sufficient enough. This automatic parameter in this case chose 15% as our target free space. And so if we scroll down and look at how that impacts the sizing of our VSnaps, we can see that that 15% was equivalent to 36 terabytes, which totaled out our physical capacity to 276 terabytes. Now we then divided that amongst 3 VSnaps, each of 100 terabytes. So right off the bat, you know that you've got a little extra fat here because we've actually recommended 3 VSnaps, each of 100 terabytes. So that's 300 terabytes right off the bat. So you already have a little wiggle room. Now, if you don't think that extra fat is going to be enough, you could go up here and adjust this VSnap reserve. And in this case, let's pump it up all the way to 25%. So now if we go look at the numbers of having 25% free space, you can see that that calculates at 60 terabytes and it bumps up our physical capacity to a total of 300.3. And this worksheet blindly then says for 300.3, you'd have to have 4 VSnaps, each of 100. Well, that's a heck of a lot of fat right there, with over 99.7 terabytes of extra free space. You really have to use your eye and say, you know, in this case, a difference of 15% reserve versus 25% reserve, they all come out to be about 300 terabytes, and therefore I should have enough extra fat and enough extra wiggle space in there to accommodate my extra restores or data reuse. Now, obviously, in this example, it worked out nicely with the 300.3, even with 25%. in your example, it might not. It might be very obvious that you do need an additional vSnap to accommodate that. Another thing to consider if you do have a lot of restores or data reuse, if you have a replication site that's just being used for replication, then maybe think about doing restores from there, as long as that is close enough to the proximity and gives you the restore rates you need to the original machines. Our third example is if you want the V ADP on a separate machine from your vSnap. In our sizing example, we chose to have the V ADP proxy reside on the vSnap server, and we set that to yes. And what that impacted is when you scroll down, you'll see that you have 3 vSnaps, and each of those would have a V ADP soft cap of 12 CPUs dedicated to the V ADP. Notice here that your vSnap cores are going to be 23 per vSnap, and that your memory is going to be 120 gigabytes per vSnap. If you do the math, you're going to end up with 69 CPUs and 360 gigabytes of memory total. So let's go up and put the V ADP proxy on a separate machine and see how that impacts our environment. Now if we scroll down, we see we still have 3 vSnaps, and each of those vSnaps is going to have 11 CPU cores. So that's a total of 33 CPU cores. And the memory is 112, which is a total of 336 gigabytes of memory for the vSnaps. Plus you have one V ADP at 12 CPU cores with 8 gigabytes of memory. We end up needing a total of 45 CPU cores versus the original 69 when we had a V ADP on each of them. And we end up with a total of 344 gigabytes of memory versus the 360 that we needed when we had a V ADP on each of them. Another thing you could consider here is that you could do one vSnap that had a V ADP on it with the original numbers on each of those of 23 CPUs and 120 gig of memories. And then the other 2 would just have these memory capability and these CPU cores on them. So do look at the fact of how many V ADPs do you really need? Are you allowing for extra growth, or does it suffice to have a single V ADP out there and then the vSnaps on different entities? The fourth scenario is the impact of changing the vSnap size and what that does to reduce or increase the number of vSnaps itself. So if you remember, we chose the preferred vSnap size to be automatically chosen for the best performance, and we ended up with a vSnap pool size of 100 terabytes. If, for instance, you decided, what would happen if I chose, instead of a 100 terabyte vSnap, to have a 200 terabyte vSnap. Now if we scroll down and look at the results, you can see that with a 200 vSnap pool size, I only need 2 vSnaps. So even though you'll need 400 terabytes of space, it is going to reduce the overall amount of CPU and the overall amount of memory you'll need in this environment. It will be at a trade-off of the gigabytes per second that are going to be required for each of those vSnaps. And so if that individual vSnap cannot handle 2 gigabytes per second at the backup rate, then you might have to look at either one, going and increasing the time frame for doing the backups, the duration, or going back to having more vSnaps available. For number 5, we're going to look at the impact if you keep replication for less time or if you offload more data to the cloud. In our original business requirements, we were going to replicate all the data on a daily basis and keep it for 30 days on the secondary location. And then the replicated VMware data would be sent on a weekly basis as an offload to Cloud Object Storage and kept there for 180 days. So what happens if we change these parameters? In the sizing sheet, if we scroll down and look at the amount of data that has to be replicated, currently that's going to be 584.5 terabytes of data. And you can also see that for object storage, we will require 788.5 terabytes to be offloaded to cloud object storage and a 5.5 gigabyte per second link between the replication server and the cloud object storage itself. So for instance, if we go into the VMware numbers that we entered, instead of replicating on and keeping 30 days of data at the replicated site, what if we only kept 7 days worth of replicated data there? If we go and look at the sizing results, you can now see that instead of 584.5 terabytes, we are only managing 352.7 terabytes of data on the replication server. You'll notice that the amount of data being sent to the cloud did not change in this case. If, however, you decide, I'd really like to keep additional data out on the cloud because I've reduced the amount of data I'm keeping on my replicated site, instead of offloading once a week, I decide to offload once a day and then keep that still for 180 days. Now when I look at the sizing results, I can see that the amount of data being copied to the cloud has jumped up to 1,275 terabytes from the original 788, just because we changed it to a daily offload. So those are a couple other numbers you can manipulate when you look at your replication and your offload to cloud. The final scenario we're going to look at is if you think the dedupe or the compression ratio of a hypervisor, application, or log is not the same as your global value that you set. How can we change that? Currently in our sizer, we have the global option set to have a compression ratio of 2:1 and a dedupe estimator of 1.5:1. And these would impact all of the data that we're sending out. In order to change an individual application, hypervisor, or log's compression or deduplication, go into macros, click on the unhide advanced settings, go ahead and click run. Underneath the advanced settings tabs, you'll see we've got tabs for the VMware, Hyper-Vs, the applications, and the first thing you're going to want to do if you want to change, for instance, the VMware, you'll want to set use global estimates to no. So for instance, you could update the first backup you take, which is usually a full backup because it's all the data, to 50%. And then if you think your incrementals will also dedupe to 50%, you can set that there. Now when we go look at the sizing results, we've reduced our vSnap physical capacity to 234.4 terabytes because of this change. Likewise, underneath the advanced settings, if, for instance, you have log data reduction, if you think that the logs will not compress, you can set that to no. And then if you look at the sizing results, likewise, you'll see the change in the physical estimated capacity. So in summary, I've walked you through some scenarios where you can further customize the sizing spreadsheet to meet what-if scenarios that you might encounter when you're sizing your Spectrum Protect Plus environment. Thank you very much.